All right, so today we are going to talk about how to choose the best method when we're solving a quadratic. So you've learned all 5 of the methods that you see here below now, and now we're just going to discuss when should I choose to complete the square versus trying to use the quadratic formula? When should I graph? All of those tiny little differences that lead us to choose one method versus the other. So I've typed out kind of some overviews here. So graphing, it says we should choose it for real life situations because decimals are okay. When we solve by graphing, we are going to get decimal answers. So if it's not a real life situation or it's not a situation where a decimal answer is appropriate, then we definitely don't want to choose graphing. Because if our answer, for instance, has square roots in it, you're not going to be able to tell that from the calculator. So the other situation would be if an equation looks unusually complicated to simplify, meaning maybe you're going to have to box multiply 3 different things out before you could even combine like terms. Something like that would be a situation where graphing would be okay. Graphing does not always work. Namely, it will not give solutions that aren't real. So if your solutions are imaginary, then this is not going to work. So graphing is not going to be the method that you would choose. So you've got two main reasons for why we would choose graphing. Graphing, as long as your answers aren't imaginary, graphing is a good method for checking your work, meaning that if you get a radical answer, you could see what the decimal equivalent is and check it with the graphing method. Square roots, usually these ones should jump off the page at you because they're in a very specific form. You either just have your x squared term and then a constant, or you have a squared term that's a binomial and some constants. There are no visible plane x terms because remember this isn't a plane x because it's got the squared on it. Remember, of course, that these could be manipulated. So x squared plus c equals 0 is the same as x squared equals the opposite of c, for instance. So it doesn't have to look just like this to be in that form. This is still that form, just manipulated a different way. So if it's in that form, you most definitely want to choose square roots because we get the squared term alone and then we can just square root both sides. So that makes it pretty easy. So square roots is something that you should be looking for to try to use when it's in that specific format. So if something doesn't jump off the page as being obvious for graphing because it's either real life or crazy complicated looking, and it's not in the form for square roots, methods 3, 4, and 5 I always look at together. So basically we try to weed out methods 1 and 2 first to see if we can use those. If we can't, then you should always attempt to factor first. So in the previous videos, we've gone through how to factor with GCF, how to do perfect square trinomials, how to guess and check, all of those different methods. So you should go through your factoring order of operations and you should attempt to factor it. Because if it is factorable, factoring is going to be much faster than method 4 or method 5. So if it's not in the forms for method 1 or 2, then you should always try to factor it first. If it is not factorable, and you can see that on method 4 and 5, I put as a disclaimer, if the quadratic is not factorable, because if it is, you want to choose that. But when we are choosing between completing the square and the quadratic formula, it's based upon the numbers in that quadratic. Remember that quadratics in general, a standard form quadratic, is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And if that quadratic is not factorable, and A is 1 and B is even, then completing the square is going to be your fastest bet. It's going to be the least amount of work. If it's not factorable and either A isn't 1, so meaning you've got a number in front of the x squared other than 1, or even if A is 1 but B is not even, then in those cases the quadratic formula is going to be a better bet. The reason why is when we complete the square, and you went through this on your completing the square practice problems, if A isn't 1, that means we have to factor out the A and do the swoopy multiply. If B is not even, then that means we're going to have a fraction value that completes the square, which people tend to be a little confused about. So that's the difference between when you should choose to complete the square and when you should choose the quadratic formula. Completing the square and the quadratic formula are the only two methods that will technically work for any quadratic. Now, again, that doesn't mean that completing the square or the quadratic formula is the best choice, but it does mean that it will always work. It might be a ton of simplifying, but you could always complete the square. You could always do the quadratic formula. Both of those methods will always yield an answer, unlike the other three, because some quadratics are not factorable. Not everything's in the form for square roots, and graphing we definitely can't use if our solutions have eyes in them. Okay, so all I'm going to do here, just for some examples, is I'm going to write out a few quadratics, and I'm just going to have you, I'm going to pause it, and I'm going to have you decide which method you think would be the best for that particular quadratic. And you're not going to solve it on this one. You're just going to simply say, this is the method that I would choose and why. All right, so here are the three examples, A, B, and C. So take a couple minutes, look at each of them, go through the different methods and what we talked about, and then just write down what you believe would be the best method and your explanation as to why. So pause the video while you do that, and then come back so that you can see what I said for the correct answer. All right, hopefully you've got your three answers here. For part A, this one is definitely one where we would choose to solve by graphing, mainly because it's very complicated. In order to actually solve that quadratic algebraically, we would first have to FOIL out the x plus 3 squared. Then we would have to try to combine like terms that involve radicals, which would make it really, really messy. We could definitely solve it using the quadratic formula, but it would take us a very long time. So this is an example other than a real life situation where we would probably want to solve by graphing, just because it would take way too long to do all of those steps by hand. On B, first thing I would do here is to move this constant over to the other side, just so I can look at it to try to decide if it's factorable. I know that it's not in the right form for square roots because I've got a linear term. So I always try to look to see if I can factor, but if I were to factor this, this would be the chart method, chart factoring, and there's nothing that multiplies to 3 that adds to -5, which means this isn't going to be factorable, and if it's not factorable, since B is not even, this one is going to be the quadratic formula. So quadratic formula, because can't factor, and B is odd. All right, last one. I would start this out the same way. X squared minus 9x, add the 14 to both sides, equals 0. Here I'd be looking for factors that multiply to 14 and add to -9, which this one I can find those. So that means, yes, it's factorable. So because it's factorable, we factor it. And I know it sounds weird, and your English teachers would tell you you can't use a reason as because it's factorable, but because that's like the crux of when we choose 4 and 5 is when it's not factorable, it really is okay to say we factor because it's factorable. So hopefully that helps a little bit and you are feeling confident about which method to choose when.